Wow, thank you, Judge Jones. It's such a pleasure to be here, and like Judge Jones, being at a conference which in some ways when you're in the section doing this kind of planning, you feel like you're at a wedding or something where you're doing a lot of stuff. This has been on the calendar circled forever and ever, and just can't believe we're here, and it's just so great. Before we get going, Judge Jones mentioned a whole bunch of people who are responsible for organizing the specific panel, but this entire event, this luncheon, and the vision that drives our section around DEI is led by an incredible group of section leaders who are on our DEILP committee, and I want to just acknowledge them. They are on the committee Alan Bowie, Jaleh Dafa, Kathy Hebenwa, Jalinda Johnson, Osai Miazad, Laurel Purdy, Brenda Sutton-Willis, Anna Wermuth, Jason Wojciechowski, and Joanne Wong. And from the council liaisons to the committee itself, Lisa Banks, Melinda Burrows, the Honorable Stephanie Jones, Joe Torres, and Eunice Washington. So a round of applause for that group. Okay, let's get to it. So on this panel, everyone that you see here has, in the course of their lives and careers, been working to advance issues with and for the transgender community. But we thought it made sense before we kind of talk about issues that we talked about ourselves, and that we situate everyone on the panel in their personal story and how they came to be doing work with and on behalf of the transgender community and kind of what that means to them. So I might just kind of go down the line here, and Dee, maybe I'll start with you just to share.
Okay, my name's Dee Farmer. I'm with the National Center for Lesbian Rights. I am the petitioner in Farmer versus Brennan, a Supreme Court decision from 1994. I went to federal prison at the age of 19, began advocating and litigating the rights of transgender inmates, including myself, and I did that for the entire incarceration of about 20 years, and then upon my release, I began to apply that law to the transgender community on the outside, as well as those transgender persons being released from prison, and I just continue to do that work today.
Yeah, Dee, you're a magical person in the community, so just to take a moment, honor that. So, Drian, how about your story?
Hi, everyone. So honored to be here with all of you tonight. My name is Drian Juarez, and the intersectionality of my story is that I'm an immigrant. I'm somebody who had to access the sex work for survival and transition. I started doing activism because of a hate crime. I often share with people that I was shot in the face, and I have a glass eye today because of that, and that's really what spurred on my activism. I started as an HIV health educator, working with the most marginalized in our community, and then was recruited to start the Transgender Economic Empowerment Project with the LA LGBT Center, and then expanded my activism globally when I became Grindr for Equality Global Partnerships Manager. And currently, I'm the VP of Training and Culture for Folks Health, a telehealth company. And so for me, it's always been important to do work that was meaningful, that helped the community. It's been the way that I've been able to heal myself from the trauma that I continue to experience as a trans woman of color in this world. And so I'm really happy to be here with all of you and get to share that.
Oh, thank you so much. Anya.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here this afternoon. My name is Anya Marino. I grew up in South Florida, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, actually, and although most people see Fort Lauderdale, Florida as an LGBTQ vacation spot these days, it certainly wasn't the case when I grew up. Indeed, it was a significantly more conservative environment, and I was labeled at a very early age as having behavioral problems simply because I was expressing my gender in a way that seemed authentic to me, which was extremely confusing and also, was compounded with being a Latina person in a preparatory school because my parents worked very hard to send me to one of the finest schools in South Florida. When I went to study at undergrad, I finally revealed myself to be the trans woman that I am. But while I was there, I also continued encountering a lot of adversity and challenges, and oftentimes found myself seen as an outcast from other members within the LGBTQ community at Johns Hopkins University. Now, to be clear, Johns Hopkins is a significantly more inclusive environment today than it was while I attended, and I'm very proud of the university for making those changes. But while I was there, one of my close friends actually was murdered. And she was also a trans woman of color. She met a man one evening while she was out. I was actually supposed to be there with her that evening. And they went back to her apartment. He bashed her skull in, and he set her apartment on fire. And she suffered for 6 days at Hopkins Bayview Hospital before she passed away. Due to a series of challenges that arose during the prosecution of the murderer, he went free to only be again arrested and convicted of his wife's own murder a decade later. But much like Drian, I would say a lot of my work and activism within the community is related to trauma resolution. And a lot of the experiences that I personally have encountered as a member of the trans community and as a woman of color, but also witnessing how many other members of the community that I've seen still struggle to identify housing, have access to education, have access to gainful employment, have access to health care so that they can get the gender-affirming, medically necessary, life-saving treatment that they require. And I'm just so happy to be here with you all today.
Thank you so much, Anya. Tracy.
So my name is Tracy Wallace, and I grew up in Gainesville, Texas. I usually just say Dallas because when I say Gainesville, people say, oh, Gainesville, Florida. And I said, no, Gainesville, Texas, so I just say Dallas. But I have been involved with LGBTQ rights for really well over 20 years. I started my involvement with an organization in Dallas called Lambda Legal, and I worked with that organization in Dallas for a number of years before I was elected to the national board. And the last 2 years that I was with that organization, I was national co-chair. And one of the things that we did with Lambda Legal and are still doing with Lambda Legal that I'm really proud of is the Transgender Rights Project and the different lawsuits and litigations that have been brought by Lambda Legal for bathroom access, for healthcare access, for access to particular rights within the prisons, for access to have prisoners be placed in particular situations that identifies with their true self, and that they also be protected in the prisons. So that is how I became involved. And after my role with Lambda Legal, I'm still involved because I do advice and counsel for another Texas organization by the name of Equality Texas, whose main goal is to pursue legislation, fight the excellent fight in Texas to pursue legislation that helps with respect to all kinds of LGBTQ rights, but more specifically, bathroom access, access for kids to play sports and identify as their authentic self, legislation for identification, which I know we're going to be talking about today, which is so important, and healthcare access.
Great, thanks. And I'll just say, so I'm Kelly Dermody, and my pronouns are she and her. I am a cisgender lesbian. My connection with the community is through advocacy and serving as a board member of the National Center for Lesbian Rights, where we did a lot of advocacy involving issues of sexual orientation, of course, but also gender expression, stereotyping, gender identity, and trans rights. And so I sort of got my feet wet there. And then as a lawyer at my firm, I've done a lot of pro bono with Transgender Law Center, including representing Tamara Lusardi in her sort of groundbreaking case before the EEOC where she was challenging the denial of access to the bathroom consistent with her gender identity, and won a result that determined that denial of access to the bathroom that's consistent with your gender identity is sex discrimination and violation of Title VII. And I see these connections as being very tied up in my own liberation as a woman and as a lesbian. Let me turn a little bit to the historical context with our panel. So one of the really frustrating things sitting inside the LGBTQ community is the erasure of intersectional experiences, and in particular, the centering of cisgender whiteness in our own community. And there's a lot of history that was led by transgender women of color that has impacted all of our lives. And I kind of want to amplify a little of that history today. Anya, do you want to kind of talk about some of the just really important moments and maybe sort of talk a little bit about Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and their impact on all of us?
I'm happy to, Kelly. First, I want to preliminarily pause, though, and acknowledge that there has been, in large part, an erasure of trans women of color, non-binary people of color, who have done meaningful work throughout the movement, and that's in part because trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people, for the longest time, were seen as taboo, and so much of that is connected to traditional ideas about womanhood and manhood, and it's really an extension of misogyny, noting that anyone who's non-male or non-masculine in their identity and expression is sadly seen as inferior traditionally. It's just the standard. But there have been some incredible trailblazers that have done really meaningful work on behalf of the community. As you noted, Marsha Pay It No Mind Johnson is one of those people. She is a founding member of the Gay Liberation Front following the 1969 Stonewall riots. And that group's first act was organizing a march to demand an end to the persecution of LGBTQ people. They also denounced racism and urged others to begin really rethinking the standards of the nuclear family and also gender stereotypes. She's also a co-founder of STAR. Many of you may know STAR. It's the full name of it, because it is an acronym, is the Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, and she co-founded it with Sylvia Rivera. And STAR provided shelter to homeless LGBTQ youth throughout New York City. And they were known for criticizing more mainstream cisgender advocacy groups for ignoring transgender people. And among perhaps the most public and critical moments was Sylvia Rivera's speech, actually, in 1973 at the Christopher Street Liberation Parade, where she stormed the stage and actually criticized other parade participants for ignoring or outright erasing members of the LGBT community, most importantly, trans women of color who were subject to the carceral system. And then both she and Marsha P. Johnson were very involved in ACT UP, which some of you may also know as the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which was a grassroots organization that really brought the need for access to quality medical care in a universal way during the midst of the AIDS crisis. And sought legislation and policy changes on behalf of people who are HIV positive.
So as you described, even with these two stories, so many of the kind of movement leaders have kind of emerged through interactions with police. And Tracy, I'm wondering if you want to kind of comment on some of the leaders that have come out of that experience, but also some of perhaps like the strategic opportunities for coalitions because of the criminalization of certain peoples across identities.
Sure. So one of the things that strikes me when I think about, for example, Marsha P. Johnson and the Gay Liberation Front, is I think about how that organization really kind of set the standard and was the jumping point for some of the organizations that we know of today, like a Lambda Legal, like an HRC. If you don't have a gay liberation front, I don't think that you have these organizations. I mean, these were the trailblazers. These were the ones to set the floor and not necessarily the ceiling. The activism that you had at the Stonewall Uprising led to a lot of the organizations that you see today that is doing the good work in terms of transgender rights. And then when I think about the issue of intersectionality, I think that that's a word that's used a lot. And then we have to think about, well, what does that mean? I mean, when you say intersectionality, what does it mean? And then specifically, what does it mean for transgender women of color? I think when you talk about that, you have to look at where do things connect? Where is the connection? And if you're specifically talking about a transgender woman of color and the obstacles that a transgender woman of color face, let's just break it down section by section. Number one, you're a woman. I don't think there's any woman in this room, and more of our male counterparts, that wouldn't say that women experience discrimination in the United States. Number two, you're a woman of color. And I think that everyone sitting in this room understands and knows, I mean, I certainly do, because it's a lived experience for me, the type of discrimination and issues that women of color go through. And then let's add to that being a part of the LGBTQ community. So I've just listed 3 things where they intersect. You're a woman of color, you're in the LGBT community, and let's add one more thing, sort of the most important thing, you're transgender. So I've listed 4 different categories, 4 different ways that your lived experience intersects with all kinds of different groups. So you're in the LGBT community. Where is an example or a place where you can partner with someone to move everyone's rights forward? Or an organization like Lambda Legal, or an organization like HRC. What about when you intersect and you're a person of color? Well, one of the organizations now that's doing things for people of color and raising issues specifically related to people of color, the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a part of the Black Lives Matter movement that specifically says Black trans lives matters. And that is an example of how intersectionality can work to move the ball forward for everyone. I know that when I was co-chair of Lambda Legal, one of the things that we talked about all the time is that everybody's issues has to matter to everyone else. You can't expect, or I can't expect, that you're going to show up for me and care about my issue if I don't show up for you and care about your issues. And I think there's a discussion later on today that's going to talk about LGBTQ law and how that's moved forward in terms of the Bostick case. But I think that one of the things you're going to talk about is the Macy case, Macy versus EEOC. Everybody's heard about that. That was a case involving transgender rights. And from that case, from that administrative case, we now have Bostick. So I think that the law is replete with examples where rights that have been fought for and died for transgender women of color has moved the ball ahead for everyone.
Thanks, Tracy. And in your discussion of that reminds me of another kind of footnote for those that are inside the LGBTQ movement, and it really is this kind of long schism in the family between arguing for equality versus arguing about deconstructing gender. And the difference of viewpoint has largely been that an equality standard is sort of equal to what? And if you're trying to fight for, nothing should matter in terms of sexual orientation, it's just one extra thing, and then everything else goes back to normal, that really is fighting for a kind of liberation of cisgender white gay men. or economically privileged cisgender white gay men, and you're kind of leaving everyone behind. And it sort of has historic antecedents in the women's movement, and whether, the women's movement would take on racism, or really would be about kind of just a deconstructed gender as if that exists for women of color. So these things can also bleed into very profound differences in our family, of the LGBTQ family, about how you go about dismantling systems of oppression. Do you really dismantle it? Do you blow it up? Or do you just rearrange it in some way?
So Kelly, one thing that you actually said really resonated with me, and that is noting that there is somewhat of a challenge between fighting for equality and acknowledging the nuances of gender sometimes. And that was actually something that Sylvia Rivera, during that Christopher Street March, discussed at the time, because oftentimes she and other transgender people were actually being accused of being misogynist by simply expressing their authentic gender. And that was one of the reasons, unfortunately, that led to the undoing of STAR, was a rejection by other community members of the work that Sylvia and Marcia were doing at the time.
Yeah, horrible. Let's turn also now, Dee, to you, because this is not an abstraction, this history. I mean, you have been like a living driver of change, and I think it'd be really interesting to hear kind of how you came to essentially bring one of the most important cases, not only for transgender rights, but for prison rights and civil rights, kind of starting out in the 80s in a men's security prison in Indiana for credit card fraud.
I was very much into school as a child, but I had to leave school because of the constant attacks that I received. In elementary school, it was just minor attacks, verbal, maybe having rocks thrown at you, and it was just for being feminine, not for dressing as a woman or dressing as a young lady or young girl. And then as I went into junior high school, the attacks became more aggressive. And then when I went to high school, they were even overt and almost destructive. And so I stopped going to school, and I became involved in the underworld of the LGBT community. And many of them were involved in sex work, robberies, different types of crime. Some of it I found inappropriate for me as a person, just as my morals and principles, and didn't square with just common sense to me. And so I became involved in credit card fraud and writing bad checks. At the age of 19, I was convicted. By that time, I was undergoing a transition, taking hormone pills, dressing full-time as a woman. And so this is how I presented myself in the courtroom, and it was very much frowned upon by my own lawyer as well as the judges. And I had case in both state and federal court, and consequently the state judge gave me the maximum sentence, which was 30 years, and the federal judge gave me the maximum sentence, which was 20 years. And the sentences were to run consecutive. So I had a total of 50 years for credit card fraud. And so I went to federal prison, and eventually I ended up in a maximum security prison, and I was still presenting as a woman, still had the feminine characteristics and mannerisms that I had had all of my life. And so I went into the population, and I was very much alarmed at what I witnessed when I first got there, which was inmates. They were drinking, they were doing drugs, and I was like, wow, this is almost worse than the inner city, the kind of stuff you witness in the inner city. And so I stayed in my cell a lot. I tried to stay around inmates that were from my part of the town, city and state. But within a week after being in the population, an inmate entered into my cell in the evening, and he asked me what was I going to do, indicating was I going to have sex with him. And as I tried to reason with him that this was not appropriate, and he just was not listening or comprehending what I was saying. And he began to attack me, to beat me with his fist, in my face, to kick me onto the floor, bang my head up against the bars. And eventually he had a knife in his tennis shoe, and he pulled that out. And then he held me down on the bed, and he raped me. And when he was getting ready to leave the cell, I was sure that he was going to kill me, because they often do this in prison to keep you from telling, to get them more time or getting charges. But he didn't, he left. And so I went to the officials, and I was placed in protective custody. And while I was in protective custody, I realized that there were many transgender girls in this penitentiary, and many of them had suffered the same type of sexual assault and abuse that I had, but they felt that they had no choice but to accept this. But I didn't feel that way. I felt that I needed to challenge it. And so I challenged it, saying that prison officials should have known that placing me, a 19-year-old, in this violent prison with these inmates who were serving life sentence, never getting out of prison, would subject me to all types of abuse and danger, including rape. And I could not find any lawyers to help me. I reached out to many law firms, many legal clinics at law schools, and no one would help me. No one believed in, that prison officials had any duty to protect me. They felt that I was a prisoner, and that prison officials had the right to place me wherever they felt was appropriate. And I continued to challenge it. I lost in the federal district court. I lost in the federal court of appeals. And I petitioned the Supreme Court. I wrote the petition myself while in segregation. Nothing but available to me, but books that I could order hardback federal reporters from the main law library. I submitted the petition, and eventually I got word that it had been granted. I was elated. I asked the ACLU, National Prison Project, if they would represent me. I had been doing a lot of work with them around the rights of inmates with HIV and AIDS. And so Alvin Bornstein agreed to represent me before the Supreme Court. His deputy chair, which was Elizabeth Alexander, argued the case because we felt that it should be argued by a woman. The Supreme Court decided the case and unanimously held that I could sue prison officials for placing me in danger. And consequently, prisoners all over the country, not just transgender prisoners, but perhaps prisoners that had provided information to government officials, or even you find often in prisons that very young males come into prison for having dealt drugs, and they too are often subject to sexual assault and rape. And so the law again began to be applied in more broad aspects. And and so throughout, and I continued my advocacy in prison, working on post-conviction, other transgender rights, about strip searches, medical treatment, often bringing cases on behalf of other transgender inmates as well as even inmates who were suffering from terminal illness. And I just continued to do that work, often reaching out to lawyers and law firms. And most of the time I was rejected, but I did develop meaningful relationships. One of the first professors to accept a collect call for me, someone, just a prisoner calling you out of the blue, was John Boger at the University of North Carolina, who eventually became the dean of the law school. He provided me with tons and tons of advice as well as reference, even sent me the law books that they provided to the law students so that I could study. And then after a while, he even got permission to send some of his students into the prison so that I could help them to learn about prison law. And from there, I did develop relationships with some lawyers at Arnold and Porter, Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston, and a few other law firms. And I developed relationships with the National Center for Lesbian Rights, the ACLU. And I just continued to do this work throughout my incarceration, which lasted for about 19 and a half years. And there were many adversities. I was subject to segregation often for assisting other inmates or even for sometimes bringing administrative claims against prison officials. They would retaliate. But I just felt that the work was important and that prisoners had no other resource or hope, and that I spent all day in the law library, and many prisoners came to me asking for advice, and I just felt that being there just to help them, even if I felt that they had no win in getting their case overturned or getting their rights recognized, that I could provide some hope for them, and I continued to do that until my release. And upon my release, I was offered a position with the National Center for Lesbian Rights as a transgender legal advocate and advising on transgender cases. And that is what I have been doing. Currently, I am there's a lack of reentry programs for transgender people coming out of prison, and so we are trying to open up transgender halfway houses for transgender people coming out of prison to provide them with some of the substance that they need to be successful and overcome their obstacles.
Amazing. Amazing. Power of one person to change the world. It's really, really powerful. I want to know if any other panelists want to comment on the importance of Dee's work in your own lives.
If you don't mind, I'll share. I mean, I think it's really important to note that, first of all, I feel so honored and privileged to share a stage with one of my heroes right now. And I really want to thank you for being here and sharing your story and for making such an incredible impact and lifting up the voices of other community members that have otherwise been ignored for so long, Dee. And it's because of your work and your courage that we have the Prison Rape Elimination Act. It's because of your work that other advocates within the LGBTQ movement are bringing carceral cases representing other LGBTQ people. Indeed, I myself right now am representing 3 trans youths who, as you mentioned earlier, the Black Trans Lives Matter movement, they were participating in such a march in Miami-Dade County and were all arrested and subject to significant misconduct by correctional officers while they were there. But it's because of your work that we're able to do these cases. So thank you so very much.
You're very welcome.
Amazing. So, Driana, I'm going to turn to you. We've been sort of talking a little bit about historical battles, and there's some TV shows on now that have transgender characters, and it looks like everything's all better, right? It's all we're done.
Right, that's the picture that's often painted, but the reality is that we're still in a fight for our rights. It feels like our rights can be taken away depending on the administration. And so, I think there's still a lot of work to do, and I think there's a lot of work that people can do themselves, and I think it's important to think about the diversity within your own workplaces, to think about bringing in trans people and advocating that your workplaces hire more trans people. And also make sure that your environment is set up to foster the success of a trans person. It's great to have diversity trainings, but what about your policies? How are you setting people up for success? What kind of ways are you protecting people from what happens in the workplace, from people being outed to violence? And so there's more work to be done than just putting a pride flag on your website or saying that you're an ally. It really takes being committed to what it means to create a safe space for everyone, but more importantly, trans women of color, who, by just simply walking out the door, we never know what's going to happen. We never know how people are going to react to us. I've been trans for more than half my life, and I'm still having to be careful about where I'm walking, if somebody's looking at me a little too much. I have not been able to rest since I transitioned. It's a constant source of stress in my life to walk out into the world and not know if I'm going to make it home that day. And so, I hope that out of today, you will all be committed to truly including trans people in your work, in your life, and in all that you do. Take trans people into consideration. This is November, which is often considered Transgender Awareness Month. Next week, we have Transgender Day of Remembrance. This year, there have been 43 trans people who have been murdered simply for being themselves in the States. And so there's still so much work to be done, and it seems as if as we get more visibility, more public view of who we are, the violence increases. And so it's also about making sure that you educate your children about what it means to be inclusive and diverse and not causing harm to others simply for being different. And so this is a challenge to all of you to really commit to creating a world where we can all thrive. We all have a place in this battle. And so I hope that that's one of the things you take away from today.
Thanks, Drian. And then, in the work you're doing in the LA community, what are some of the hot issues that you're seeing, or maybe they've just been the issues that continue to be seen?
For me, it's really about economics and giving trans people good jobs. And oftentimes people think, okay, I'm going to give this person a job, and that's it, it's done. I've done my deed. But the reality is that there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that people thrive. And it's not just entry-level positions. Look at your C-suites, look at your boards, look at your directors. How is the diversity there? Are there any trans people in those spaces? And if they're not, make it a goal to add trans people to those spaces. That's when things really start to change. That's when we can be economically empowered and allowed to thrive. And so, I think economies continue to be a hot topic for our community. We're still underemployed or not employed at all, and still forced to do things like the street economy, survival sex work, because we can't get jobs. And in Los Angeles, it feels like things are great, but when you go outside of this state, or even into the rural parts of the state, it feels like we're in the early 1900s, and trans people are still experiencing violence. And so, while you see more trans people on TV, the reality of our lives continue to be very difficult. And so I think it's important to open up those workplaces, but also make sure that you give trans people a pathway into thriving in those workplaces. And so for those of you in positions to hire trans people, prioritize hiring trans people. When you include that diversity, you really open up people's minds to what it means to include others into spaces that are normally reserved for cisgender hetero identities. That is the future. If you look at youth, the majority of youth are starting to identify as genderqueer, gender nonconforming. This isn't going away. This is the future.
I wanted to add, last month, the end of last month, I finished a project with Human Rights Watch, a study they were doing on violence against transgender women and men within the community. And my role within the project was to interview transgender women and men around the United States to explore their lives and what the violent experiences that they had endured. And the main root problem that most of them identified was unable to find employment, and many of them had suffered discrimination in employment, discrimination in housing, and they could find no one to represent them. No one willing to even listen to, their story, to offer them any kind of legal advice. And so it is a profound thing that many transgender persons cannot find employment and they can't find representation.
And what about sort of health access issues, and thinking, again, sort of intersectionally about some of the attacks that we've seen on women's health access generally, inclusive of transgender women, but it seems like that we haven't solved that problem either. I don't know, Ani, if you wanted to talk about that. Yeah.
Sure, I'm happy to. So access to medically necessary life-saving care continues to be a challenge for most trans women, and especially trans women of color, who oftentimes resort to going to persons engaging in the unauthorized practice of medicine who are pumping their bodies full of illegal silicone. And if the individual who's undergoing this procedure doesn't die from a pulmonary embolism within the first 24 hours, they typically either end up experiencing silicone rot within their body or end up developing cancer. And that's in part because insurance companies overwhelmingly create clinical criteria that categorize medically necessary gender-affirming care for trans women as cosmetic, when indeed it's not. And so one of the things that I actually want to circle back to, Drian, that you noted was that if we're truly committed to equality and increasing diversity within workplaces, we have to do it in a way that is equitable, and we have to recognize that there are members of our workforce who are unable to access medically necessary care because of the ways that our insurance companies are creating clinical criteria that categorically exclude care that many transgender women need. And ultimately, that results in self-harm, increased gender dysphoria, and also in some instances death because they go to someone who's unauthorized to practice medicine. So, I mean, it also means making sure that when you're identifying health insurance programs for your employees, you're doing so in a way that you're identifying plans that are really providing opportunities to access that care, and asking to look at the clinical criteria, because oftentimes, even assuming they don't have express language that categorically excludes all gender-affirming care in their health plan, you need only look to the clinical criteria and you see the huge disparities that exist for trans women as compared to trans men. And it's interesting that ordinarily the only medically necessary care that is afforded trans women is bottom surgery, which when you think about it is incredibly misogynistic because it in essence is reducing womanhood to what exists between a person's legs. And that should truly offend everyone here.
Thanks. Yeah. So we have a great opportunity in this panel, I think, to talk a little bit about power and privilege and the way our intersectional identities may influence our outlook on that. And I'm curious from the panelists, what have you learned about dismantling inequality, or how has your intersectional identity kind of influenced your strategy around that?
Well, one of the issues I think that we can talk about with respect to power and privilege is the right to vote. That is one of the issues that is top of, I don't know, everyone's mind today, as we have different states doing different things as far as voter identification and the right to vote. And we understand that different laws are being enacted about what type of ID you need in order to cast a vote in this place versus that place. Well, let's add on top of that, you know, the transgender, very important issue of correct identity documents. All right. You go anywhere today and you need identification. If you want to write a check at a grocery store, they ask you for your identification. If you want to catch a flight somewhere, they ask you for your identification. If you want to sign up for health care, they ask you for your identification. If you get housing insurance, they ask you for your identification. And one of the other topics that's in the media is, you know, being stopped by police. What's the first thing they do when they ask you, when they stopped you? Give me your license and registration, your ID. And let's think for a second, what if we have identification that does not match up to who we authentically are? Right. We have an identification that doesn't match what the police officer or the person who's selling the home insurance or the person who's accepting your check at the grocery store. What if we have ID that doesn't match up to how we authentically present ourselves? Well, then we have problems. You have a lot of issues. And so, you know, the organization that I was talking about before, Equality Texas, one of the things that they are doing is trying to enact legislation within the state of Texas that makes it easier to get gender markers or to change your identification. Because within the state of Texas right now, you need a court order in order to have the Texas Department of Public Safety change your driver's license. And there are all kinds of barriers to getting a court order. One of them is financial. It costs money to file a claim with a court in order to get your identification claimed. And if you don't have that money, you can't do it. Now, you can petition the court and say, I don't have enough money to do that, but that's another process that you have to go forward. And then you have some judges, no matter what is said, will not give you that order. So one of the issues that we can look at in terms of intersectionality is all of the voting rights communications and issues and planning that we're talking about right now, and we need to make sure that that planning and what we want to put forward in terms of defeating those or making sure that those are equitable for all is to make sure that transgender people, and specifically transgender women of color, also have the access to the right to vote. If you don't have access to the right to vote, you cannot change a lot of the things that are going on in this country that need to be changed, and more specifically, that relate to the transgender community and transgender women of color. And I think that is where criminalization comes in. And there are laws that are on the books now that criminalize activity that shouldn't be criminalized, or in these cases, that you have courts and systems that are allowed to hand out sentences that don't match the crime that was committed. Or you have policing that has way too much leeway in terms of how they want to treat someone when there's a simple stop. You know, say, for example, give me your license and registration. Well, this license doesn't match up to the individual that I'm seeing. I mean, there have been times where, you know, you've been pulled over and I don't have this, but I can show you this identification, and they let you go. There are far too many times, especially for transgender women of color, that is not the case. That not only are they not let go, but then they are arrested And then once you're arrested, you're put into the system, and then you're put into the system that doesn't recognize who you really are. And then you end up incarcerated in a system that doesn't protect you for who you are. So I think there are a lot of things that we can get together on and we can talk about and we can plan about, but one of the most important ones, from what I can see, is making sure that the right to vote is not only protected for everyone, but also most specifically transgender women of color.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah. Anya, did you have a comment?
So I was just going to simply say that I can't agree more that voting is indeed preservative of all other rights, and indeed that's what the Supreme Court noted in Yik-Wo. And beyond that, it is so incredibly important to be able to have access to that access to the franchise so that you can have an impact even at the local level and be able to make decisions about your school board of education, your board of public health, your county executive or county council. And oftentimes when you have access to correct identity documents, which is often the case, unfortunately, in West Virginia, where there's presently absolutely no process to get a birth certificate that reflects your authentic gender. And if it weren't for the ACLU and the Harvard Law LGBTQ Advocacy Clinic presently filing a case against the state of West Virginia, that would continue. But the point is, certainly identity documents continue to be a huge issue for members of the transgender community, and an issue that unfortunately is often overlooked because we as a community oftentimes take for granted how we needn't have to have identity documentation that needs updating or a correction. And unfortunately, transgender women and transgender men and non-binary people do indeed.
Thanks. Triana, I was going to ask you, on this question of going back to power and privilege and the way in which your intersectional identity influenced strategy, what are your thoughts about that? Do you think that it has really made you look at the world differently? And if so, how?
Well, for me, when thinking about power and privilege, I think oftentimes people think, oh, it means having a big bank account where you can buy a house and what have you. But when we're talking about power and privilege for trans people, we're talking about the basics. Everyone in this room who is cis-identified has privilege that trans people don't. You can walk out onto the street and you don't have to worry about being attacked simply for who you are. You can walk into a restroom and you don't have to worry about somebody calling the police or accusing you of being a predator. When you walk into a space, people honor your pronouns. They don't misgender you and out you. For trans people, it's the very basics of our lives that we don't have the privilege of accessing. And so I think when we're talking about power and privilege, it's really at that basic level that we're still at for transgender people. And so I think it's recognizing that the field is not leveled for trans people, and even accessing the most basic of resources becomes difficult for us. And so I think, it's recognizing that that's at the place that we're starting when we're talking about power and privilege. And so there's still so much work to do, and we're in the 21st century, and we're still having to deal with all of that. And so it's still, unfortunately, at the very bottom for trans people.
Can I add just something to that? I apologize.
Not at all.
I don't mean to be a chatty Cathy.
We invited everyone to talk, so yes.
Okay. Well, I want to come back to employment just real briefly, because we are at the Labor and Employment Law Conference, and just kind of discuss my own experience as a trans woman working as an attorney. And when I indeed even felt safe enough to come out as trans again, I noted earlier that I was out as a trans person when I was attending my undergraduate education. But when I decided to actually go to law school, I cut off my hair and pretended to be a gay man for 3 years, and then pretended to be a gay man for an additional 6.5 years of practice, because I did not feel safe enough within my legal community to be authentic. And that's in part because when I was looking at going to law school, I didn't see other people who looked and had stories like mine. And that was so important to me when I finally got out into the community and saw youths who are now attending school acting authentically. And that's what really gave me the courage to be myself. But beyond that, even when I did come out, there are still significant issues within our legal community that remain. So for example, I can't tell you the number of times that I've been parts of litigation teams where I've had more junior members of the teams dismissing the opinions or strategies that I'm offering because I happen to be trans and because I happen to be a woman of color. And it oftentimes requires my male, cis, white counterpart to just simply repeat exactly what I just said to get heard, and to have a strategy that I would hope is sound and oftentimes works out, thank God, be implemented. But the reality is that is still an issue for so many members of the community, whether you are trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, a cisgender woman, Black, brown, or an immigrant working within our community. And we as a community have so much work to do within itself to create a more inclusive environment such that we're actually acknowledging people's competencies and skills and talents and allowing people to do the work that they intended to do when they decided to become lawyers and advocate for other members of our community.
So glad you added that. Dee, do you want to comment on this sort of power privilege question? And you've brought so much personal courage and fortitude, but against what might seem to be sort of insurmountable odds, and yet you did.
I think that I would elaborate on what Audrey said is that once I remember experience, I was representing myself in a case about receiving hormone therapy from the prison system. And so we actually went to trial in Madison, Wisconsin, and I was required to represent myself at a jury trial, a civil jury trial. And the U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney, of course, was on one side with the prison warden, and perhaps I believe it was the health administrator responsible for the prison medical treatment. And so as I was talking to the jury and as well as talking to the judge, I would see that they would be laughing at the strategy or the opinion that I was offering. But, it just so happened that I happened to actually win the case. But I find that lawyers, of course, lawyers aren't by themselves, even judges, and of course they're lawyers too. But often judges, when they receive pro se complaints from prisoners, they pretty much take a hands-off approach, and I found that that's pretty common with lawyers. Even recently, I have been working with a compassionate release project for federal prisoners based on a change that they happened in 2019 to the federal compassionate release law that allows the federal judge to release a federal inmate for any reason that the judge finds is extraordinary and wants the inmate's release. And so recently I had a prisoner who had stage 4 cancer. He had numerous medical conditions, and he had filed for compassionate release, and the petition had been sitting before the judge under advisement for 18 months. And they had predicted that he had less than 2 years to live, so that meant he had 6 months, to try and get out of prison. And when I became aware of it and became involved in the case, I reached out to, I guess it was at least a dozen lawyers, and none of them were willing to take the case, even though you're doing nothing but arguing to the judge, that this is a reason to let this inmate out of prison. And so eventually, I did find someone to take the case, and I found two experts medical doctors, to provide opinions, that the inmate had 6 months to live and needed to be released, so that he could get medical treatment to help him just, have some relief during this time of suffering, because in prison, they would only give him pain medication at night to help him to sleep. And so he was in significant pain throughout the day, and there was many notations in the inmate's medical chart where the nurses had noted that he would be howling in pain at night and early in the morning. And so the medical experts, they even believed that he had had a heart attack that went undiagnosed. And so we got Nora O'Donnell at CNN to focus on the story, as well as to reach out to the federal judge. And about 2 weeks after we filed the supplemented petition, the judge did release the inmate, and he's home, getting medical treatment. His wife is giving him intravenous treatment on a daily basis, but they do not believe he has long to live. But that's just an example of the absence of the legal community, willing to help even in dire situations.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dee. And I don't want us to end on a note without some optimism. So I wanted to ask each of the panelists what gives you hope. And we're right at the end of our time, so it's going to be a rapid fire. What gives you hope? I'll start with you, Tracy.
I think it's a running theme for the panel today. What gives me hope? The youth give me hope. And I say the youth give me hope because they don't really care about the past issues or concerns that have dragged this country for the last 100 or so years. They're more concerned with how we move this country forward. How do we move everything forward? I'm going to be who I am. You're going to accept me for who I am. I just believe everyone should be treated equally. There's the question that has been asked, or that has been, I've heard it. I think everybody's heard it. Why should we care about something that doesn't affect me? And I think the youth resoundingly say, because it's the right thing to do. It's basic human dignity and safety. And so that's why that gives me hope, because they're not concerned with anything that impacts me personally. They're looking at everyone's rights. How do we get equality for everyone? So I think when I say it's the youth that give me hope.
Great. Anya.
I would echo what you said, Tracy. I think the youth certainly give me hope. They inspire me, and they're one of the reasons why I'm thriving today and living authentically, because I saw the courage that so many of them have and don't question. I think, but beyond that, I would also say this panel, this discussion that we're having here gives me hope. I mean, it's not lost on me that we're occupying a space right now that Hollywood has used for generations. And it's a space that until recently was used to exclude people of color, people who are trans, people who are non-binary. And here we are on this stage discussing these really important issues. So that also gives me hope.
Fantastic. Drian.
I would like to third what y'all said, that the youth definitely inspire me, but also the parents of these youth. Parents who are going to school meetings and saying, you let my child be themselves, you protect my child. Parents are coming out as the biggest advocates for trans people because they see their child and they don't want their child to suffer. They want their child to live full and happy lives. And it's that love that is inspiring them to get out front, to become activists, to challenge laws, to challenge these regulations that exist that keep us from accessing sports, from being able to participate in activities that everybody else gets to participate in. And so I think parents are also giving me a lot of hope because they may not fully understand what it means to be non-binary, to use non-binary pronouns, but they understand the love that they have for their child. And that's what inspires me. And I hope that that's something that energy carries through to other family members, that they see it's about people getting to live their life fully. That's what trans people want. They want the same thing as anybody else, to get to live a life that feels good to them. And so parents are also really inspiring.
Fantastic. And Dee?
So what gives me hope is it's definitely the youth, and it's definitely the demand or transgender LGBT community demanding that people recognize their rights. But what really gives me hope is that throughout my work, especially in prison, I was always looking for a judge to be responsive, a lawyer to be responsive, not just to transgender rights, but just to humanity, issues of willing to extend humanity to an individual. And over the years, I found that more and more people have become responsive, people in a position to provide assistance and to make a change, people in authority to make the difference. And that really gives me hope to find that, more and more judges, more and more lawyers, they are being responsive to these issues of disproportionate people at disadvantage, just needing their assistance and needing them to step in. And I find that more and more of them are doing so, and that really gives me hope.
Thank you. Well, these panelists give me hope. Wow, that does not give me hope. But these women give me hope. Give them a round of applause, please.